The wind, a malevolent sculptor, railed against her, tearing at the tattered shawl, lashing her face with shards of ice. Alara stumbled, each step a testament to sheer, desperate will, not strength. Days had blurred into an endless white agony, the landscape a vast, indifferent canvas painted in shades of gray and frost. Her boots, thin and worn, offered scant protection against the unforgiving ground, hardened to iron by the pervasive cold. Hunger gnawed at her, a hollow ache that resonated with the emptiness in her soul, the echoing void left by the fever that had claimed her family, one by one, leaving her utterly alone on the unforgiving frontier. She was a ghost, wandering through a world that had forgotten her, barely clinging to the thread of life. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, each exhale a fragile protest against the biting air. Then, through the swirling curtain of snow, a faint smudge of gray against the stark white horizon. Smoke. Her heart, a weary, battered drum, pulsed with a sudden, improbable hope. It was a beacon, a desperate prayer answered in the desolate wilderness. She dragged herself forward, muscles screaming in protest, the image of warmth, of shelter, driving her onward. The smudge solidified, resolving into the rough-hewn silhouette of a cabin, squat and defiant against the vast, empty sky. A crude dwelling, yet in that moment it was a mansion, a sanctuary. She reached the door, a rough slab of timber, and raised a fist that felt weighted with lead. Her knuckles, raw and numb, rapped faintly against the wood. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a man. He filled the doorway, a towering presence silhouetted against the dim light within. He was built of stern stuff, his face weathered and etched with lines that spoke of silent years lived under the open sky. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore into her, holding no warmth, no pity. "Please," Alara rasped, the word a raw whisper torn from her throat. I have nowhere." Her voice was a fragile thing, betraying the terror and exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. She swayed, her vision tunneling. The man's gaze remained impassive, betraying nothing. He seemed a part of the wilderness himself, as unyielding as the land that surrounded them both. He did not invite her in, nor did he turn her away immediately. He simply stood, a sentinel of solitude. After a long moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity of freezing agony, he stepped back, a barely perceptible shift that offered a narrow sliver of passage. Alara stumbled across the threshold, falling onto the rough-hewn floor, the sudden warmth from the stone hearth hitting her like a physical blow. She lay there, shivering uncontrollably, her body trembling with the accumulated cold and terror. He closed the door, plunging the cabin back into relative shadow, then moved, silently, to a corner, his presence a heavy, watchful weight. He said nothing, yet his silence was not one of indifference, but of a profound, almost ancient quietude. He had lived silent for years, it was clear, a man apart, and now she had intruded upon his solitude, a fragile, desperate trespasser. Days bled into weeks within the confines of the silent cabin. Alara, slowly mending, learned to navigate the contours of Silas's profound quietude. His name, uttered once by her in a tentative whisper and met with a single, slow nod, was the only word exchanged for what felt like an age. He was a creature of habit, rising with the first hint of dawn, moving with an economic grace that spoke of years spent honing his survival in the wild. He chopped wood, tended his snares, and repaired the cabin with a methodical precision that bordered on ritual. Alara, once a sheltered woman of a fledgling town, watched, absorbed, and began to understand. His silence was not empty. It was filled with the keen observations of a man who listened to the land, who understood its rhythms and its unforgiving truths. She found her own quiet rhythm, beginning to contribute in small ways. She swept the packed earth floor, mended their few garments with clumsy but determined stitches, and prepared the simple meals of smoked meat and dried berries that Silas provided. Each task, no matter how small, was a reclaiming of herself, a tiny victory against the despair that still lurked in the corners of her heart. The initial terror of his stoic presence slowly receded, replaced by a tentative respect, then a fragile, unspoken understanding. There was a peculiar comfort in his proximity, a silent anchor in a world that had ripped her adrift. She often found her gaze drawn to him, trying to decipher the unreadable depths in his eyes, wondering what stories lay buried beneath that impenetrable quiet. He never offered a glance in return, yet she sensed his awareness of her, a constant, watchful presence that was both unsettling and profoundly reassuring. The harsh, unforgiving land outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth, a quiet, almost domestic peace, began to take root, nurtured by necessity and the shared burden of existence. Then, one evening, as the last vestiges of a cold, pale sun bled from the sky, a different kind of quiet descended. It was not the familiar, companionable silence of their shared space, but a sudden, expectant hush from the wilderness itself. Silas, who had been honing the edge of a hunting knife by the firelight, stiffened. His head lifted, eyes fixed on the door, his movements fluid and primal. Alara felt a prickle of unease, an echo of his unspoken alarm. Then, a faint sound, carried on the crisp evening air, a rhythmic thud, growing steadily louder. The door, without a knock, swung inward, revealing not the expected lone traveler or the returning wind, but 7 women. Their faces were etched with weariness, their traditional garments dusted with the long miles they had clearly traveled. Comanche women. They stood framed against the indigo twilight, their proud stance softened by exhaustion. Their eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over the cabin, assessing everything, resting for a moment on Alara, then settling on Silas. Their leader, a woman of formidable bearing despite her fatigue, met Silas's gaze. No words were exchanged, but a silent conversation passed between them, a weighty exchange of questions and unspoken answers. Alara held her breath, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew the stories of the Comanche, of their fierce independence and their often brutal encounters with settlers. Yet, these women, despite their stoic pride, radiated an aura of profound need. Silas's hand tightened on the knife, his brow furrowed, a rare display of internal conflict. Alara saw a flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes. Recognition? Reluctance? A burden taken on? After a long, drawn-out moment, he made a barely perceptible gesture with his head, a silent invitation. The Comanche women, with no discernible change in their expression, filed into the cabin, their movements economical, their presence filling the small space with a new, potent energy. The leader offered Silas a single, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude, then turned to her companions, guiding them to rest by the fire. Alara watched, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. The cabin was no longer just theirs. It was a precarious haven, its quiet dignity now challenged by the unspoken history that had just walked through its door. A new kind of silence settled, heavy with anticipation. The small cabin, now housing 9 souls, became a crucible of unspoken tensions and shared humanity. The Comanche women were as reserved as Silas, their movements graceful, their eyes constantly assessing their surroundings and the strange white woman who moved among them. Alara found herself navigating this new landscape of quiet observation, a bridge between 2 worlds, neither truly hers, yet bound to both by the shared roof. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that Silas had taken on a profound responsibility. These women were not just seeking shelter from the elements. They were seeking refuge, their presence hinting at a deeper, unseen threat lurking beyond the walls. Silas, for his part, moved through this new arrangement with an unsettling calm. He offered the women food, water, and space without a word, his actions speaking volumes. He knew them, Alara realized. Not personally, perhaps, but he understood their ways, their unspoken language of honor and survival. There was a history there, a connection to this land and its original inhabitants that she could only begin to glimpse. She saw the way his gaze often drifted to the window, to the narrow slits in the logs, his senses acutely attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind, the distant calls of unseen creatures. As the second day wore on, a new, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere began to press in. The air grew heavy, the silence outside the cabin no longer comforting, but ominous. The Comanche women, usually stoic, began to exhibit a subtle restlessness. Their leader, her face a mask of ancient wisdom, exchanged a series of silent, meaningful glances with Silas. A palpable sense of dread began to seep into Alara's bones, mirroring the growing anxiety she saw reflected in the eyes of the other women. It was the quiet before a storm, not of nature, but of something far more menacing. Silas was out checking his traps when the first sign manifested. It was not a sound, but a vibration felt through the earth, a faint tremor that resonated deep within Alara's chest. The Comanche women, whose ears were attuned to the faintest whisper of the plains, heard it too. Their heads snapped up, eyes wide with a sudden, chilling certainty. Alara followed their gaze to the window. In the distance, a faint, dark smudge appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly, dissolving the pristine white of the snow-covered plains into a churning cloud of dust. It was not a small party. It was vast, an approaching wave of dark, moving shapes. Silas burst back into the cabin, his face grim, his eyes burning with an intensity Alara had never seen. He said nothing, but his actions were swift and decisive. He pulled the heavy wooden bar across the door, sealed the shutters on the few windows, plunging the interior into a dim twilight illuminated only by the hearth fire. The cabin became a fortress, albeit a small, fragile one, against the enormity of the approaching storm. The rhythmic thunder of hooves grew to a deafening roar, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound softened, lessened, until it was replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. They were there, thousands of them, 700 warriors, their forms darkening the landscape, surrounding the cabin in a silent, impenetrable ring. Alara pressed herself against a log wall, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming force of their presence was suffocating. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her, but something else, too, a fierce, protective surge. These women, these strangers who had sought shelter, had become her responsibility, bound to her by Silas's unspoken code. The vast silence outside was punctuated only by the occasional snort of a horse, the rustle of a warrior's regalia. The cabin was an island, a tiny, defiant speck in a sea of unknown intent. The ultimate test of Silas's solitude, and of Alara's newfound resilience, had arrived. The cabin remained shrouded in a tense, unnatural quietude. Outside, the ring of warriors held firm, their presence an unyielding, silent declaration. Hours stretched, each moment an eternity, suspended between the threat and the unknown. Alara, huddled with the Comanche women, felt the chill of the logs seeping into her bones, but her fear had sharpened, transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. She no longer trembled. Her gaze darted between the women, their faces stoic and proud even in the face of such overwhelming odds, and Silas, who stood by the reinforced door, a silent sentinel, his rifle held loosely, ready. His face, etched in the dim light of the hearth, was a mask of calm, betraying no hint of the gravity of their situation. He was a man prepared to face the impossible alone. As the first faint light of dawn began to pierce the reinforced shutters, casting thin, dusty shafts into the cabin, a ripple passed through the surrounding circle. A single figure detached itself from the mass of warriors, approaching the cabin slowly, deliberately. He was an imposing man, adorned with feathers and paint, his posture radiating authority. He stopped some 30 paces from the door, his eyes fixed on the small, defiant structure. Silas, without a word, pushed the heavy bar from the door. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing the stark expanse of the snow-covered plains and the waiting warrior. The air crackled with a silent challenge. Alara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Comanche women inside remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Silas stepped out, alone, into the biting morning air. He offered no greeting, no sign of aggression. He simply stood, a man facing an army, his presence a silent question. The Comanche leader inside the cabin made a soft, guttural sound, a sound of recognition, or perhaps, understanding. The warrior outside raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that might have been parley. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant in the vast silence. A string of words in a language Alara did not understand. Silas listened, his expression unwavering. He responded with a few, clipped words, his voice low and gravelly, words that carried the weight of years and unspoken history. Alara could only guess at the meaning, but she intuited the gravity of the exchange. This was not a negotiation of terms, but a declaration of principles, a test of honor. A silent bargain was being struck, a deep, ancient understanding passing between two men who knew the land and its unforgiving laws. The warriors had come for the women, for reasons unknown to Alara, but Silas's unyielding stance, his solitary defiance, was forcing a different outcome. He was not just offering shelter. He was offering a challenge, a claim of protection that demanded respect or battle. After what felt like an age, the warrior turned, a slight nod of his head acknowledging something in Silas's unwavering gaze. He returned to the gathered ranks, and with an almost imperceptible signal, the vast contingent of warriors began to move, not towards the cabin, but away from it, a dark, churning river flowing back across the plains, leaving behind only the churned snow and a lingering echo of their formidable presence. They departed as silently as they had come, melting back into the horizon until only the vast, empty landscape remained. Relief washed over Alara, profound and dizzying. The Comanche women rose, their faces now softened by a quiet dignity. Their leader approached Silas, her eyes dark pools of gratitude. She placed a hand over her heart, then motioned towards the women, then back to Silas, a gesture of profound respect and thanks. Without further ceremony, they gathered their few possessions and, with a final, communal nod to Silas and a shared, meaningful glance with Alara, they walked out into the newly silent plains, disappearing over the same horizon from which the warriors had emerged. Alara stepped out, breathing deeply of the crisp, clean air. The world felt reborn, cleansed of the suffocating tension. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him. He was no longer just a silent, capable man. He was a keeper of ancient codes, a protector of the vulnerable, a beacon of strength in a world that often demanded utter solitude. He had faced down an army for those he chose to protect, for reasons that transcended words. In that moment, the last vestiges of her despair crumbled. The vastness of the plains remained, unforgiving and beautiful, but she was no longer adrift within it. She had found an anchor, not in a place, but in a quiet, unbreakable bond. He turned to her, his gaze holding a new, softer quality she had never seen. Their shared ordeal had forged a connection stronger than any words could convey. Alara, who had stumbled into his solitude broken and fearing the world, now stood taller, her spirit renewed, armed with a quiet strength born of shared peril and the unspoken promise of a future built on resilience, side by side with the silent man who had chosen to stand for what was right.